Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have another great show for you tonight. You know, we've been bringing you the latest hemp news and cannabis views from around the world for over 25 years, since October of 1996. Tonight's show, which I believe is 1114, we have a longtime Florida medical marijuana patient and activist, Cathy Jordan, along with her associate, Jodi James. And Cathy Jordan has been fighting Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, for a long time. She's long outlived her original diagnosis. We'll have her on a little bit later in the show. We have an interesting hip news segment for you. And as always, we'll bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, our first hip news story tonight is from right here in the Beaver State, in Oregon. The 2022 Oregon legislative session was huge for cannabis this year. It adjourned sine die on Friday, March 4th, just last week. We have several bills that passed. HB 4016 passed a marijuana license moratorium. The Oregon Senate passed HB 4016, enacting a sweeping moratorium on new cannabis licenses in the state. The law takes effect on an emergency basis following Governor Brown's signature, or 30 days from now if she doesn't veto, and she won't. The industry got what it wanted here. The walls are going up. This is one of the most consequential pieces of Oregon cannabis legislation ever. It can be understood as evidence of regulatory capture by the current industry. This bill started as a proposal to reinstate a moratorium on marijuana producer licenses, but quickly morphed into a moratorium on all license types, along with a retroactive ban on virtually all OLCC marijuana license applications from January 2022. Until March 31st, 2024, the law gives OLCC discretion to refuse to issue new processor, wholesaler, and retailer licenses, while extending the Senate Bill 218 moratorium on producer licenses. It seems certain that the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Control will exercise that discretion and refuse to accept all of these applications or issue new licenses for the foreseeable future. Yes, there will be litigation. Hundreds of new license applicants were submitted after January 1st, 2022, when the original moratorium expired, and people have invested time and money into these applications under the reasonable expectation that their submissions would be processed. What a mess. Another bill, HB 1564, passed the hemp license moratoria. They almost did it with hemp too. Senate Bill 1564 initially proposed a controversial statewide moratorium on Oregon Department of Agriculture hemp grower licenses for fiber, fuel, food, and CBD. As passed, however, it merely allows county commissions to request that the Oregon Department of Agriculture deny hemp license applications if those counties declare a local state of emergency. Application denials may be retroactive to January of 2022. Expect to see Jackson and Josephine counties each to declare emergencies to start. The deadline for all counties to do so in 2022 is a week from today. As I'm recording this, March 15th is the deadline. HB 4061 also passed, illegal grows and water preservation. This bill establishes new prohibitions and penalties of up to $25,000 for anyone providing or receiving water at an unregistered or unlicensed grow site. Our next story tonight is from Virginia. Several things have been going on there. Republican members of the House General Law Subcommittee halted any further advancement of Senate-backed legislation, SB 391, that sought to initiate retail marijuana sales to adults beginning in September. So even though the voters passed it, the new Republican legislature rejected it. Committee members rejected the measure on a 5-3 party line vote. Republicans took control of the House of Delegates in Virginia following the results of the November 2021 midterm election. Not content to merely kill the early start of adult-use marijuana sales, Virginia Republicans went on to kill a bill that would lighten sentences for those already behind bars for cannabis possession. A push to recalibrate the sentences of people incarcerated on marijuana-related crimes won't move forward this legislative session. And that's doubly unfortunate because the adult use of cannabis is legal now in Virginia. Down in Central America, Costa Rica's Congress passed a bill which legalizes the use of cannabis for medicinal purposes. The bill also allows marijuana cultivation for industrial use. The cultivation and sale of adult use marijuana for recreational purposes, however, will remain banned. The NCAA, or National Collegiate Athletic Association, has taken a progressive step forward with respect to their policies regarding athletes' personal cannabis use. These updated rules follow similar changes enacted by the NBA, the Major League Baseball Association, and the NFL, all of which relax their cannabis testing policies. Changes to the NCAA's policy include increasing the threshold of THC that must be present in an athlete's body in order to trigger a positive test result so that it's consistent with that of the World Anti-Doping Agency, from 35 nanograms per millimeter to 150 nanograms per millimeter. The punishment for a positive drug test for THC was also heavily relaxed, with the possibility of suspension being deferred from the first positive test to the second, and the length of suspension being decreased from 50% of the season to 25%. These welcome changes that reflect the changing cultural and legal status of cannabis. Studies have shown that cannabis is not a performance-enhancing agent, so it's inappropriate for athletic bodies to impose punishments for those competitors who consume it while off the field. This is a timely and welcome change for the NCAA, and it coincides with similar policy shifts in a number of professional sports organizations and global athletic institutions. From Washington, D.C., over 700 banks and credit unions have filed paperwork with the U.S. government acknowledging their relationship with licensed cannabis businesses, according to quarterly data provided by the United States Treasury Department. The total is an uptick from the first quarter of 2021, but it remains shy of those totals reported in the first quarter of 2020. In all, the agency identified 553 banks, about 11% of all U.S. banks, and 202 credit unions, or about 4% of U.S. credit unions, that are actively providing banking services to marijuana-related businesses, end quote. I can tell you that to apply for one of these marijuana bank accounts, you have to pay a $500 application fee and a $500 a month service fee on your checking accounts there. It's very expensive for marijuana banking businesses. Federal law discourages banks and other financial institutions from maintaining relationships with marijuana businesses because the plant remains classified as a Schedule I controlled substance. On 6 occasions, members of the U.S. House of Representatives have passed legislation, the SAFE Banking Act, to explicitly permit banks and other institutions to engage in relationships with marijuana businesses without running afoul of federal law. House members most recently did so last month, attaching the measure as an amendment to the America Competes Act of 2022. The act is currently awaiting action by the United States Senate. Over 70% of participating cannabis businesses said that the lack of access to banking or investment capital is their top challenge. By comparison, only 42% of respondents cited state regulations as the most significant burden facing the industry, and 39% cited the influence of the illicit market. Personally, I started helping medical marijuana patients back in 1999. Starting in 2007, I started having my bank accounts closed. I have had my bank accounts closed on 20 different occasions since 2007. And out of those 20 different bank closures, the banks told me 18 times they could not tell me why my account was being closed. They said they didn't have to tell me the reason the account was closed, but 2 times they said it was because I helped medical marijuana patients. Our next story is from New Mexico. New Mexicans aged 21 and older will be able to begin making retail purchases of cannabis and cannabis-infused products on April 1st, according to an update issued by state regulators. State lawmakers in New Mexico last year passed House Bill 2, the Cannabis Regulation Act, which immediately allowed for adults to possess and home cultivate marijuana, and which also established a framework and timeline for the commercial production and retail sale of cannabis products. Under the law, adults may legally purchase up to 2 ounces of marijuana and or up to 16 grams of cannabis extract from licensed retailers. The retailers are anticipated to be operational on April 1st. New Mexico's Cannabis Control Division says that the agency has already issued nearly 100 licenses for cannabis producers, manufacturers, and retailers. In a separate development in New Mexico, justices on the New Mexico Supreme Court have determined that medicinal cannabis products like conventional prescription medicines should not be subject to gross receipts taxes. The court ruling upholds a lower court's decision barring the collection of certain excise taxes on medical cannabis products. In New York regulators are set to approve a rulemaking so people with prior marijuana convictions or whose family members have been harmed by marijuana criminalization will get the first round of adult use marijuana retailer licenses ahead of existing medical cannabis businesses. The proposal to create the conditional licenses will be taken up by the New York State Cannabis Control Board on Thursday. It's a move that would set the state apart from others that have enacted legalization but face criticism over a lack of promised equity results. New York's Governor Cathy announced the plan as first reported by the New York Times. The Office of Cannabis Management Executive Director Chris Alexander told the New York Times that he expects upward of 200 justice-involved applicants to receive the priority licenses under the proposal, with retailers potentially coming online by the end of this year. To qualify for the conditional license, an applicant would need to have been convicted of a cannabis-related offense prior to March 31st of 2021, when the state's adult use legalization law was enacted. Those who have a parent, legal guardian, child, spouse, or dependent who face such convictions would also be eligible, as would those who are themselves dependent on someone with a conviction. From up north in Seattle, the use of either whole plant cannabis or synthetic cannabinoids is effective in mitigating back pain, according to a review controlled studies published in Global Spine Journal. A team of investigators affiliated with the Swedish Neuroscience Institute in Seattle, Washington, conducted a systemic review of the use of cannabinoids to treat non-surgical back pain. In each of the studies identified by the investigators, quote, there was quantifiable advantage of cannabis therapy for alleviating back pain. There were no serious adverse side effects reported by patients in any of the studies, end quote. According to longitudinal data published earlier this month, patients with chronic musculoskeletal back pain who use medical cannabis for a period of at least 6 months experienced decreased opioid use and improvements in pain scores and in their daily functions. This study, The Efficacy of Cannabis in Reducing Back Pain, a Systemic Review, appears in this month's edition of the Global Spine Journal. Israel will soon decriminalize adult use and expunge criminal records of those convicted of personal cannabis possession or use. Israel's President Isaac Herzog and Justice Minister Gideon Saar announced upon approval of the new regulations, those with adult use convictions will be able to submit a request to have their records voided. An added bonus is that with pending criminal proceedings, will be able to contact the police with a request to drop the charges. The move, said the statement, will lift the criminal labeling and stain that accompanies it and complement decriminalization regulations published last month. Israel's Minister Saar will sign the regulations in the coming days after public comment. Shortly thereafter, approval by the Knesset will happen, followed by immediate implementation. Our last story tonight is from Texas, the Lone Star State. After clinching the Democratic nomination for Texas's governor this week, Beto O'Rourke took the stage and made a promise that he could define his fall campaign. He says, and don't you think it's time we legalize marijuana in the state of Texas? I do too, he said after thunderous applause. The former congressman went on to say, we can get this done. I hope so, Beto. That's the end of our Hemp News segment tonight. Now we go on with an interview with Cathy Jordan, a longtime medical cannabis patient, and her friend Jodi James. If you are a loved one, are looking for help finding a doctor who can help you get a medical marijuana permit, please call our office at 503-235-4606. If you have any questions about cannabis, marijuana, or medical marijuana doctors, call us at 503-235-4606. Without further ado, here's Cathy Jordan and Jodi James from Florida. Stay tuned and help us restore hemp. Good night. It's my honor and pleasure to have on a couple lovely ladies here who've been active in the marijuana movement for more than 20, 25 years. we have Cathy Jordan and Jodi James in Florida. Cathy is a ALS patient who was given 5 years to die about 25 years ago, but has fought for the right to use cannabis. And Jodi has been working with her and the movement in Florida, the Cannabis Action Network, and we'll be talking about both of their work. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Good to have you. So let's start with either one of you can tell me how Cathy and first Cathy was drawn into the medical marijuana movement.
May I, Cathy?
Go right ahead.
Well, you know, I think that there's a difference, and maybe her entry to the movement happened probably out of telling her no. And one thing that if you know Cathy Jordan very well, you'll realize very quickly that the last thing you want to do is tell her not to do something. Cathy, when she was diagnosed.
I love contrarians.
And you've known a patient or two like that, right?
Yeah.
Over your decades of experience. When Cathy was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease and given kind of a death sentence, I don't think that it was in her mind in those first few years that 35, 45 years later, she would still be alive and kicking. There was, you know, every few years, she'll have a teary moment and say, I never expected to get to here. I never expected to get to here. But she had come to Florida and realized, and that's just an amazing, beautiful story. Cathy, may I tell the story of how you ended up in Florida, Cathy?
Yeah, right ahead.
Cathy had been given 3 to 5 years to live, as you mentioned, Paul. That was in 1986. And so when she came to Florida to winter in Florida in 1989, the way she described it is that it was her plan to winter here in Florida where it was warm enough that she could save enough of her muscle relaxants that when she went back to Delaware, she could die with dignity. That was the plan. In 1989, and you'll know this firsthand, patients were surviving. They were using cannabis as medicine. They were starting to talk about it, and people were starting to know. Cathy's friend, who was a nurse practitioner, said, you know, Cathy, cannabis is doing things for people. You should try it. And of course, at that point, the question is, what's it going to do? Kill me?
Yeah.
So Cathy smoked a joint.
Was that in Florida?
It was on a beach in Bradenton, Florida, which is very close to her home now. The strain of cannabis was called Mayaca Gold. And the guy who grew that cannabis, the family that grew that cannabis, was later sentenced to life in prison and then ultimately pardoned by Bill Clinton. So, but you know, no one knew in 1989 when she smoked that joint on a beach in Bradenton that it was a neuroprotectant, and that fast forward 15 years and the federal government would have a patent on cannabinoids as neuroprotectants. But Cathy told people that she felt her disease stop. So she flies back to Delaware with cannabis in her bra, and she gets back and she tells her loved ones that pick her up at the airport to get this. She'd already had limited use of her hands, and this was marijuana that was stuffed in her bra.
And she had before the scans and 9/11 and all of that.
But this crazy woman had flown from Florida to Delaware with cannabis. And when she went to the first doctor and said, Doctor, I used cannabis and my disease to stop, they started talking about putting her in a home, because with Lou Gehrig's disease, the first thing that goes is your mind. Right. And she had to be delusional because there was no way that her disease had stopped. But that wasn't what made Cathy an activist. That's what made Cathy a cannabis patient. That's what made Cathy understand and know that there was no way that she was going to go the next day without cannabis. It was when a support group told her that if they found a cure for Lou Gehrig's disease, that she would not be eligible for a cure because of her illegal drug use. Cathy Jordan became an activist. And that's what we're celebrating right now.
That
was February. That was 25 years ago.
I personally have worked with well over 100 patients who are no longer with us, who were denied the ability to have a transplant, receive treatment because of using medical marijuana, and many more patients than that gave up cannabis and gave up the benefits because they wanted to get, stay on the list for a transplant or get the medical treatment.
Right. And we still see that to this day in Florida. It is still one of the battles that we fight. So I think that was the, February 22nd, 1997. An activist was born. Over the next 20 years, if you pinpoint the high points in Florida's evolution from where we were in 97 to where we are today, Cathy is a pivotal point in most every action that we've done, and it's been an honor for Florida Cannabis Action Network to support her in that. Cathy actually served as a chapter president with Florida Cannabis Action Network in the early 2000s and moved into the presidency of Florida Cannabis Action Network in 2011. So she served as our president when we passed our first bill, which allowed for low THC cannabis in 2014. And she worked with us as our president when we passed our constitutional amendment. So in Florida, unlike some states, our medical marijuana program is embedded in our Constitution, which I think makes it all that much more grievous that we still have to pass bills that allow people to do things like be on a transplant list.
And you have to get 60% of the vote at the ballot box to put it, a super majority vote to be able to win in Florida.
Correct. This is one of the most challenging states in the union. Back in 1996, when California passed, and then shortly thereafter, Oregon and Washington State, and then, it was kind of moving towards Colorado at one point. The national movement said that Florida would be the last state because it is so onerous, and that was in the 2000s. Cathy has collected signatures on the side of the road with her family. Been to Tallahassee repeatedly. We had a bill in Florida with Cathy's name on it. So, there was a lot of things that brought us to here. But at this point, as we look towards the future, we're really, as far as we've come, we're nowhere near done. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the message moving forward. We have an entire industry that is thriving in so many states. And one of Cathy's missions moving forward is really to harness the power of that industry to remove cannabis from the Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the social stigma and this irrational fear of THC seems to be the biggest hurdle to overcome. The onerous regulation around THC, I can understand treating it like alcohol at first, but the studies and the science don't support treating cannabis like alcohol. It's not, you don't overdose on it. You don't black out on cannabis. You don't attack people. It's just a lot safer, and it doesn't make you sick. It doesn't destroy your and like you said, it has. I hold we've co-evolved with cannabis for tens of thousands of years, and that cannabis has changed us, and we've changed cannabis, and it's basically was at the very root of civilization itself. I think the science supports that, and more science we're finding every day just adds credence to that hypothesis.
And archaeological studies show that wherever there was civilization, there was cannabis, and it was being used medicinally, it was being used industrially, and it was being used ritualistically. But, part of breaking that stigma is another one of the missions that Cathy's really putting forward right now. And that is to make sure that the medical community is getting the kind of education that they should. Here we are, we've known about the endocannabinoid system for more than 50 years, 60 years, what? Wait, 60 years. They've been patents on some of the cannabinoids, and yet every doctor in the world isn't being trained on how to incorporate cannabinoid medicine into a person's wellness. So that was one of the things that when Cathy said as she was looking towards the future, that was what we were looking to see happen.
One of the first medical marijuana doctors in modern times, Dr. Todd Mikaria, said we're up against the pharmaceutical industry and monomolecular mercantile madness. And that, if they can't patent it, if they can't make a lot of money off of it, they aren't going to tell doctors about it. And doctors just don't get much education in pharmacology at all. Doctors only take one class in their whole 4 years of medical training that talks about pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, they get most of their education from the pharmaceutical companies themselves, which has obviously economic interest in continuing that. So, how does cannabis affect Cathy? How did cannabis first help you when you first used cannabis? How could you tell that it was stopping the progression of your neurodegenerative disease?
I had a slight hum in my body that I was unaware of. When it stopped, I knew the disease stopped.
So, and this is not the first time that Cathy said that she didn't even realize that she had a hum, that her body was producing some sort of erratic energy. Let's call it erratic energy. And that when she used that cannabis for the first time in that setting in Bradenton, and whether it was the strain of cannabis or whether it was something that the cannabis was grown in, we don't know what it was, but that stopped and it's been gone. And of course, cannabis is great for the symptoms of ALS. So she believes, and well, that was 1989. So somebody who's not me is going to have to do the math on how many years that is, but it's more than 5.
33.
More than 5. I'm going with that. So when you think about some of the side effects of cannabis, like dry mouth, one of the side effects of Lou Gehrig's disease is what they call salvarea, and that's an overproduction of saliva. So in the short term, drying up the mouth is a blessing.
I have helped ALS patients who were completely immobilized, and that was one of the main things I saw they had to do, is constantly vacuum out the mouth so that it would keep the electronic breathing machine going. I went to South Korea and took some RSO to a patient there, which was actually quite dangerous. But I noticed that initially that he was pretty far gone, a very famous South Korean basketball player, very young man too.
Wow.
How old were you, Cathy, when you first had the diagnosis of ALS?
I was 36.
I see.
And a lot of the football players get ALS.
So Cathy was 36 when she was diagnosed, and part of her mission, I bet, for the last 10 years has been to talk about athletes and Lou Gehrig's disease. She mentions that a lot of football players have Lou Gehrig's disease. And of course, it's called Lou Gehrig's disease after the famous baseball player who was first diagnosed with it. But ALS, and don't ask me to say what ALS stands for, that's her. And I don't even try to repeat it after her.
Lateral sclerosis.
Yeah, he's
Biotic lateral sclerosis. I'm probably wrong. But I'm trying.
Cathy can get it right, but good luck getting the subtitles in later. And we discussed earlier, you know, when regular head traumas, exposure to all of the chemicals that they put on the field. Between the two, it's hard to tell why so many athletes are prone to some of these neuromuscular diseases. But at the end of the day, we're very excited. We're going to be having our first sports medicine conference in Florida coming up in May. So we're excited about that.
If somebody interested in finding out more about the sports medicine conference in May, how would they find out more?
I'll make sure to forward some information to you.
Okay, we'll put
so
that
that you can get that out. Absolutely.
And so you're celebrating Cathy's 25th anniversary and encouraging people to use the link hashtag
Stand with Cathy.
Stand with Cathy. Tell us about that.
Well, you know, really, it's going to be fun to go through in a couple weeks and see all of the people who have been involved. And Cathy, one of the things that she did when she came out in 1997 is she treated it like it was a mission. She put her blinders on and made the decision that she was going to make sure that she and her family were safe. And again, we talked about medical necessity. There are some ways that in the 90s and early 2000s, patients in Florida could be safe, but it required being arrested. So, you know, Cathy was an outspoken advocate from 1997. And one of the things that we're doing in this anniversary party that we're holding on the 20th is kind of looking at the milestones. And so this hashtag Stand with Cathy really marks some of the milestones that have been impactful, at least in my mind, not just in Florida, but around the country. I posted some pictures today from a Drug Policy Alliance conference with Cathy and Dr. Carl Hart. Cathy and Dr. Raphael Mechoulam were able to meet in 2003. And people are interested. They're interested in why she's still alive. They listen to her. And she was intuitive about this early on. By intuitive, she understood what was going on in her own body. She understood that cannabis, how it was affecting her, and then the science caught up with her. So it'll be interesting to see the scientists that she has worked with over the years as they come forward. One of the video clips that kind of what got us together is a mutual friend that has actually been videotaping Cathy and her journey since 2000. So we literally have more than 22 years of video footage that are out there, and there is a movie called Catching Up with Cathy. And so this is kind of an opportunity for us to honor what's been done in the past, the sacrifices that so many heroes and sheroes in the movement did, but also to look at what we need to do next. Again, remove the Controlled Substance Act and really harness the movement, make sure that we're getting education in the hands of doctors, and never forget that a small group of people are able to make differences. And even in states where cannabis is legal, there's still work that needs to be done. And there's still people like Cathy who are really relevant in what we do next.
Mm-hmm. I know, living in a state that's one of the first to legalize both medical and adult use cannabis, we're still working to help patients, and there's still more to be accomplished. In our particular state, you know, the regulation surrounding it is rather onerous, but you know, it's all driven by the illegality at a federal level that makes cannabis shipped illegally across the border out of a low-cost cannabis production state like Oregon to other places where It's even in Illinois, the price of cannabis is 20 times higher than Oregon. Here in Oregon, just down the road from me, a little sign on the corner, they're selling pretty good quality flower for $19 an ounce. And so that's the lowest I've seen. But you know, with a medical card, you get a good percentage of the tax. You get all the taxes taken out, which amounts to between 20 and 49%, depending on municipality.
Wow.
So, but still, there's this irrational fear that causes the regulation that makes it very difficult for small farmers to compete with the big corporations. And the big corporations have been driving these laws around the country, and it's a constant battle.
So big corporations and consultants, and you'll forgive me for a minute to get off topic, Cathy, but big corporations and consultants, certainly the fear of THC. I've been known to say that in Florida, cannabis is legal. It's legal like dynamite, but it's legal. But you know, it's really controlled as though it were dynamite, as if it were this really, really dangerous thing. But I think that we will do well to continue to marshal the people. When I say big business and consultants, what I have been experiencing is that when these consultants come in to get an application in the next new state, you know, as we're moving east, the consultants come in during the rulemaking and the lawmaking phase, and they say, these are best practices in X, Y, and Z state. Well, they were never best practices in X, Y, and Z state. They were just the newest set of rules that we put on to make them seem more robust, like they're going to be a better steward. And so it just really has gotten to the point where the small farmer can't compete. In Florida, we're doing pretty well. Our hemp program is very open, so lots of people can compete in the hemp market. So as we move into an adult market, it'll be interesting to see. Cathy has always been a supporter of making sure that people have access to the whole plant. Home cultivation, Cathy, is kind of one of the big mantras that Cathy has spoken about all of her life. Did you want to talk about why you think it's so important to have patients be allowed to cultivate as we move the laws, Cathy? Because I think that's, people really need to understand from a patient perspective how important it is to have access to that plant.
Was also not as easy as people think. You know, growing cannabis is not as easy, especially in Florida. But if you can, you should be able to, only because like neuromuscular diseases, a lot of times I'm not one in a family, then you can have 2 or 3 children with neuromuscular diseases. And then you have to pay so much money to take them to a doctor to get permission to pick up their medicine. You have to pay $75 to get the medicine. It's just, it is insane.
So one of the things that Cathy is referring to in Florida is the cost of being part of the program. We require that you have an ID. We require, because we are a medical state, that you are using in consultation.
How much is the state fee in Oregon's medical marijuana program? I mean, not Oregon, but Florida's.
The card itself is $75, but one of the things that Cathy was pointing out about home cultivation, while it's not easy, particularly in Florida, to cultivate, if you have a neuromuscular disorder often, or some of these disorders, they run in families. And so the problem in Florida, while $75 for a card may not seem onerous, if you have 2 or 3 children who might need to be on some sort of cannabinoid medicine, you need a $75 card for each of them, and you need a caregiver card for yourself for each of them. So each child would cost you $150 plus the doctor's visit. The cost of medicine is not $20 an ounce in Florida.
What's your price there in the, they have dispensaries now in Florida. So
we do. We have almost 400 outlets.
Is that the only place you can legally obtain cannabis?
Is from one of 22 licensed, what they call the medical marijuana treatment centers. We have 22 of them that are licensed. Over the coming year, we are likely to have another 22 that will be licensed. We're waiting patiently with bated breath to go into the next application cycle. But even with 22 companies and almost 400 retail outlets, you are lucky to see $100 ground ounce, but a reasonable flower is likely to cost you anywhere between $240 an ounce and $300 an ounce still.
I see. And so home cultivation is not included in Florida's law at all.
Correct.
The only reason I haven't is because of medical necessity. My house was rated, it was a very morbid.
Cathy's home, part of the story, I guess, when we're telling the Cathy Jordan tale, we were able to introduce the first bill in the Florida House and Senate since 1978. It was February, what did you say, 25th, 2013?
No, the 21st.
There we go. February 21st, 2013, we introduced a bill in the Florida House and Senate, the Cathy Jordan Medical Cannabis Act. It was a day that's kind of memorable to a lot of people. We were very proud because we introduced that first bill. They were doing a story in the Miami Herald about a poll that showed that medical marijuana was polling at, I don't know, 70%. And that same morning, Cathy's home was raided. So it's someone who had been doing like permitting work next door, looked over a fence and saw Cathy's plants that were being grown behind a 6-foot fence in her backyard. They called law enforcement, and Cathy got a visit from the Manatee County Sheriff's Department. Some guys in masks and a lot of guns.
Did they arrest Cathy?
No.
No arrest. They seized the plants. One of the things that Florida Cannabis Action Network did in the 90s and the 2000s is we helped people to understand what we called an arrest plan. So if you were a cannabis consumer in Florida, if you were a medical patient, we were working with a doctrine of medical necessity. The medical necessity in the Florida courts say if you and I, Paul, were walking around in the on a Sunday afternoon in one of these small towns and you get bit by a rattlesnake, and I go to the pharmacy and I find that the pharmacy is closed, and I break into the pharmacy and I take nothing but the snake bite kit and I administer that snake bite kit to you, I am not guilty of breaking and entering and theft because of the medical necessity. So there's 3 different things that you have to do. You can't have sought to get bit by a rattlesnake. You can't say that you can't go and use cannabis and say that, oh, well, you know, I'm using it, but there's nothing else wrong with me. It has to be that you're, you know, what the harm that you're trying to alleviate has to be greater than the harm to society of using cannabis. And you have to have tried everything else. So as we trained patients in the 1990s and the mid 2000s, we trained them to set up their own arrest plan. It was important. And so Cathy's arrest plan on that day in February was call me. And so as soon as the family realized what was going on.
Now, you at the time, you were with the Florida Cannabis Action Network. And
Florida Cannabis Action Network, that's correct. Cathy was the president of Florida Cannabis Action Network.
at that,
And I was her executive director, that's correct.
I see.
So John started filming. John Jordan is her son, and his wife Karen was there at the home as well. So they immediately started filming, because that's how you make sure that your side of the story really gets told. And they called me. While they were continuing to have dialogue with law enforcement, we called the senator that had introduced the bill with her name on it. We called the media, and we called the lawyer, not necessarily in that order. But my husband got it out on Facebook, the number to call. And before they had even spent 20 minutes at Cathy's house, they were getting phone calls about not arresting this poor woman. So I think they got there, and John told them that they'd really stepped in it. They were taking, Cathy was a well-known activist, and they were taking her medicine. So they took the plants. They did not take some of the dried medicine that was, they didn't do a very thorough search. When they realized that they really were coming into a patient's home, they tread very lightly.
Well,
Now,
that's lucky. You had some compassionate and politically sensitive police officers there.
and it was both. And it required the family knowing their rights.
Yeah.
If they had not been outspoken medical patients, if they had not known that what to do if this situation happened, the outcome would have been very different. And we've seen that with tens of thousands of lives ruined every year for simple arrest, oftentimes just for possession of cannabis. So we always were worried. Cathy said for years, Cathy, how far can you raise your hands? So, put your hands up. That was just not getting ready to happen there at the Jordan. But we were able to present Cathy's medical evidence to the prosecutor. And in Florida, that arrest ended up being the best thing that ever could have happened to it. Had a bill with her name on it. Cathy is an eloquent spokesperson. Her family is engaged and have been in her corner all of this time. And rather than allowing the narrative to be about this poor woman, the narrative became, what would you do if someone you loved were suffering? And I think it really drove the idea that when it was time to go to the ballot in 2014 and again in 2016, we lost by 50. We had 59% of the vote in 2014. So we woke up after the election of 2014 with more than 50% of the vote, and we were still losers.
Right. Yeah. That was the thing. You had to have 60%, a supermajority, to pass a constitutional amendment via the people there. And there was a lawyer in particular, I think you mentioned him, John Morgan, who said, how was his campaign or that campaign interfacing with your organization, Cathy?
Well, I was working with the legislature and how I have to. I did not want to give up on the politicians. No, once I realized they would not allow me to smoke my medicine, there would be no smoking. Then I joined John Morgan's lawsuit.
Mm-hmm.
John Morgan's initial constitutional amendment in 2014 and 2016, Florida Cannabis Action Network really were trying to work through the legislature on that.
And for our viewers, I just want to say that Morgan and his law firm put a lot of money and was the main financial backers of medical marijuana legalization there in Florida.
He took it on more as a Democratic issue than as a medical marijuana issue. So it really became tied in with a lot of the Democratic politics in the state. which is all fine and well until you realize that Florida is a Republican state. So the Florida Republican legislature had a way they wanted to do this. They were rolling it out, and it kind of became a fight between the Republican infrastructure and the Democratic initiative people. So we have things that got written into the initiative so that it would pass. This goes back to the big business and consultants. They put things into the initiative so that it would pass because they thought it had to be there. And really, in Florida with Republicans, sometimes less.
Yeah, yeah. The things they put in were probably for their benefit more than the people's benefit. And then they said, "Oh, we've got to do it because of this, that." Really, it was just their cover-up, my opinion. But we are interviewing both Cathy Jordan and Jodi Brown, and we want to thank you guys for coming on. Jodi, tell us about your organization and how you first got involved.
Cannabis Action Network was a national organization. You had Cannabis Action Network folks up there where you're at, California, Colorado, Washington, Michigan, Massachusetts, Maine.
I just got to throw in that I was there at the founding when Debbie Goldsberry, Maria Sawitz, and started touring with Jack Herer, town to town, selling Jack Herer's book. And that was probably, about 89.
It absolutely was. So Florida has the last Cannabis Action Network chapter. You'll notice those other states that I mentioned have something in common, and that is cannabis is legal. So we're working our way out of business as the Florida Cannabis Action Network here. Our goal is to get to the point where we have been able to incorporate the existing industry into the new paradigm where we can actually bring the cannabis into the sunshine. So we've been doing this for a long time. I got involved like so many people do because I got in trouble with cannabis and I needed somebody. And Cannabis Action Network was there for me. And it's like so many other people. I stay because every day I meet someone who's had their life altered because of either bad cannabis policies or this amazing plant. And I'm moved by every last one of them. So for 25 years, Cannabis Action Network was actually founded here in Florida in 1998 to give a voice in court to activists like Cathy who were getting creamed every time they tried to put up a sign and change the law. So we were able to give activists legal standing in court. We sued 11 municipalities in the first 5 years that I was with Florida Cannabis Action Network in order to get permits to even talk about changing the law. I was blessed over the decades to encounter people who invested in me, like Jack Herer. He invested, I tell people to this day that if I am a good interviewer, it is because Jack Herer taught me the art of the pivot. It didn't matter what question you asked him, he was going to tell you why cannabis was good for him. And John Morgan, there was a doctor by the name of John Morgan in the early days that wrote a book, Marijuana Myths, Marijuana Facts.
Yeah, New York University.
It was really, that was so important, I think, to the development of this culture. Yeah. We had Jack Herer who told us everything that we've been told about cannabis was a lie. We needed The Emperor Wears No Clothes. It empowered a generation of people like me. And then we needed Dr. John Morgan to tell us that the things that we had been told by Jack may not be quite right, but there were myths about marijuana that were strictly myths, and then these were the facts, and that was John Morgan's book. And then Cathy and I were both influenced by a woman by the name of Joan Bellow, who wrote a book called Benefits of Marijuana.
Yeah,
and so that evolution took us from cannabis is bad and we've had all of these lies to cannabis. This is the truth about cannabis, and cannabis is actually beneficial for you. And in Florida, we were blessed to have Cathy Jordan to stand up and be the face of some of this information. Again, cannabis is tailor-made for people. We talked about that. I don't remember if it was before you started taping or after, but you know, we as the Cannabis Action Network have always enshrined the idea that the whole plant for the whole person. And so that's kind of been a mantra, making sure that people have access, direct access to the plant. We talked for a minute about why we need home grow, and certainly Cathy pointed to the economics of a parent with several kids that needs to have access to it. But there's really something therapeutic about growing plants in general, and this plant in particular.
And
once
there's
you
nothing
get
sprayed on it. There's no poisons. You know how it's been taken care of, you know, so.
Which is absolutely mission critical in particularly as states are developing. Just because the cannabis you got is legal doesn't mean it was tested by a legitimate third party.
Right.
Just because the cannabis you got was legal and says it was tested doesn't mean that the test was accurate.
Exactly. You know, we're about out of time. So on the 20th, it's going to be a 25th anniversary celebration. I think we're going to air this after that, but
All right.
we do have the videos. Our mutual friend Irvin Durgan in North Carolina has produced an 8-part series. I think it's about a total of an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes altogether. We're going to put those links up here, and he has produced a 10-minute video that we're going to run here in just a second. So if people are interested in getting in touch with your organizations, what's the best way to do that?
FLCAN.org, Florida Cannabis Action Network, so FLCAN.org. Cathy's fairly active on Facebook, so you can always find Cathy Jordan on Facebook. If you find Florida Cannabis Action Network, you can be connected to Cathy. She's one of our immediate past presidents. We entitled them, oh, bleep, badasses.
All right.
We were trying to come up with a great name for our immediate past presidents, and so we've just decided that that's probably where we're going to stay.
I like it.
She's earned it. We would love it. And, you know, I'm really hoping that some of the folks that will see this will have had their own experience with Cathy over the last 25 years, and that they'll get in there with that hashtag Stand With Cathy, so we can get that into the feed, make sure they put that in the description. And that way people can see some of the landmark things that have happened with Cathy in the last 25 years. It really is the history of success for people.
Well, I want to thank you, Jodi James with the Florida Cannabis Action Network, and Cathy Jordan. I've been working for marijuana and medical marijuana use for decades now. I want to thank your dedication to our mutual cause. We have this video that talks a little bit more about it. We'll have the links up for all of these this hour and a half or hour and 45 minutes of video segments coming. Well, thanks for coming on, ladies, and keep working to restore hemp.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you, Cathy.